Thanks so much, everybody. So I am not going to talk about batteries at all. So you guys get a break from batteries. You rest the battery side of your brain. Like Steve mentioned, my name is Ryan Mandell. I'm from Mitchell. And definitely, I spent about a little over 4 years working for a company called B&R Auto Wrecking in the States. We were based in the Pacific Northwest, so ran 5 of our most northern yards for that company before coming to Mitchell. So when I'm looking at the data that we see at Mitchell, that's coming from body shops, it's coming from insurance carriers, my goal is to try to give you an idea of where your businesses can evolve with this move towards electrification. How can you start to strategize to capitalize on this shift in propulsion type and really start to operationalize that as you see more and more of these vehicles available at salvage auctions. So that's kind of the context that I'm working with in here. I'm going to set the stage a little bit and just show you what the growth in EVs looks like and kind of just put that in perspective. That talk about 80% of the car park, 50% of the car park, that's still quite a ways away. So we have to understand what that trajectory looks like. It is moving extremely rapidly, but also understand that we're still going to be dealing with internal combustion engine vehicles. We're still going to have engines and transmissions that are being dismantled from vehicles. So you really have to be prepared to operate in this hybrid world, pun intended, of multiple propulsion types that are going to be facing us in the future. So what I think, when I started doing research on electrification and kind of how this has been evolving, what really struck me is how new vehicle sales performed during the course of the last 2 years and how that differs between ICE vehicles and electric vehicles. So during the last couple of years, we saw North American new vehicle sales fall by about 8 percentage points. So 8% drop in new vehicle sales. When we look at the electric vehicle segment itself, electric vehicle sales grew during that same period by 65%. So you have, I'm not sure what happened, but I plugged it. There we go. So you have the overall market falling 8%, but EVs grew 65%. So a complete dichotomy there when you look at the trends in terms of the overall vehicle market and then this particular segment. And if you look at each of the different manufacturers, you can see there's press releases that have been put out and data that's been put out by every single one of them that showed that the EV segment was their best performing segment of their entire fleet offering over the course of the last 2 years. Okay, so that to me speaks very clearly into where consumer demand is headed. As many people have alluded to already, and there's all these different forecasts. This is just this one that shows you what the global sales numbers will look like. This is they're all pretty similar and show a similar trajectory. But we really have to start looking at these vehicles as something that is totally different than what we've experienced in the past. This is not just an electrified version of an internal combustion engine vehicle. This is something that really is quite different. And I think one of the things that stands out to me is the level of complexity of the digital architecture within these vehicles. This quote from the US Secretary of Commerce, I think, really just highlights that complexity. And what she says is that their research found that new model year EVs contain almost twice the number of semiconductors that a new model year ICE vehicle has. Does anyone know how many semiconductors on average are in a new model year internal combustion engine vehicle? Any ideas? Any guesses?
3,000.
There's about 1,000. There's about 1,000 on average semiconductors in a current model year internal combustion engine vehicle. So those semiconductors, what they do is facilitate data communication and data transfer between different points of communication on the vehicle, different inputs. So you're taking input from a wave radar sensor and that's being sent to a headlight, or that's being sent to some sort of, the braking system for crash avoidance. Well, a current model year EV has on average 2,000 semiconductors. So we're talking twice the level of interconnectivity. So while these vehicles have less moving parts, the average internal combustion engine vehicle has about 10,000 moving parts, including all the components of the engine. Current model year EV has about 150 moving parts. So while you have less moving parts, those same tasks that were being accomplished mechanically before are now being accomplished digitally via the use of semiconductors. So I think that really just speaks to the complexity, and we're going to see that as we move on, and we'll start to look at some data from Mitchell Diagnostics tools, from the collision industry that shows the level of complexity of these vehicles. And again, we'll start getting into what does this mean for your business as a recycler. You know, being in Canada, you have a very unique opportunity here in terms of being really the first ones in North America to see the adoption of electric vehicles en masse. When you look at the two major countries in North America, you look at the US and Canada. So this was done, there was a study done by Ernst & Young last year that looked at consumer preference and looked at, they surveyed people and said, you know, for your next vehicle purchase, of those of you who are going to purchase a vehicle, what percentage want that vehicle to be a plug-in hybrid or a fully electric vehicle? Well, in the US, 29% of respondents said that they wanted their next vehicle to be essentially a zero-emission vehicle, plug-in or an EV. And 60% of those respondents said that they would actually pay a premium for that EV. Well, now in Canada, that number is 46%. So almost half of the people surveyed by Ernst & Young said that they wanted a plug-in or an EV as their next vehicle. And 80% of those people said that they would pay a premium for that vehicle. 35% said that they would pay a 20% premium for that vehicle. So really what we're seeing, and we have access to both markets, we have clients that we work with both in the US and Canada, is a much faster rate of adoption percentage-wise here in Canada than what we see in the US, even with California, okay? So when you look at the trend for EV growth in Canada, it's really quite significant. And you look at the percentage of new vehicles being registered, so this is new vehicles that are being sold when they are registered in Canada, 10% were EVs. Like you said, 1 out of every 10. That's today. That is happening today. 10% of the vehicles are EVs that are being registered in Canada. In Vancouver, that number is 20%. So two out of every 10 vehicles, 1 out of every 5 are electric vehicles or plug-in hybrids. And you see some of the other major metro areas. So really as a percentage base, and you can see where the US is. The US is about 6% right now. So it's important we have to understand the size of the car parks, okay? So we're talking about 10% versus 6%. Well, you know, the Canadian car park is about 40 million vehicles. The US car park's 290 million. Okay, so we have to keep this just in perspective here. But again, as a percentage basis, we see that Canada is ahead of the United States. I want you to keep this in mind. You know, to talk about moving quantities and moving batteries over borders, I think, comes into play here. Looking at the auto recycling market, looking at the used parts market as more of a North American opportunity as opposed to just a Canadian one, and being able to tap into some of this 290 million car park here. And especially if we get some consistency on some of the shipping regulations, I think that opens up a lot of possibilities. So when we look at the claims, at repairable claims in the US and Canada, what we see is in the US, under 1% of those claims can be identified as an electric vehicle. About half a percentage point as a plug-in, 2 1/3% as a mild hybrid. Those numbers all grew from pre-pandemic to 2022, but not nearly as rapidly as they grew in Canada. So the chart on the right shows you what Canada looks like. You can see over 2% of repairable claims in Canada in 2022 were were battery electric vehicles. That number almost quadrupled from pre-pandemic times. And again, we're talking 0.5% to 2%. But that is a rapid amount of change in a very, very short period of time. And again, we're talking about this move to a propulsion system that is so unique and provides so many new challenges, as many of the people have already spoken about, that it really does shift the way we have to think about these vehicles when they come into your operations. And so again, when you think about the complexity of these vehicles, it's not the mechanical moving parts, but it's the digital architecture that drives it. When you look at the diagnostics on these vehicles, so this is information that's based on about 4 million scans that have been done with our Mitchell Diagnostics tool. As you get further along the spectrum of electrification, there's more and more fault codes that are present. So this is showing you 2018 model year and newer vehicles, the number of fault codes that are showing up per scan. So for an internal combustion engine vehicle, you're getting about 31 fault codes that are showing up in a collision scan. That number is over 40 for an electric vehicle. So again, what this tells me is that when this vehicle is involved in an accident of some kind, you have to think, how are these systems being impacted by that accident? It's much more likely on an electric vehicle that you could have a rear end system, some sort of digital system in the rear of the vehicle that is being detrimentally impacted by a front end impact because of the way that these systems are interconnected. So what does this mean for a recycler? Well, what this could possibly mean is, that conversation around diagnostics comes up, is the potential to bring diagnostics into your operations, to provide that kind of Cox level type of diagnostic report with that vehicle, with any components that you're selling from that vehicle, especially if you're selling any technology components or any components that may be enabled with technology. Take, for instance, a side view mirror. If you're selling a side view mirror that has some sort of lane departure warning or cameras embedded in it, does it make sense to be scanning that vehicle and showing kind of a proof of health that that vehicle does not have any fault codes related to that system? That's one possibility. Again, trying to look for ways to add value to your parts that are going to differentiate them from others that are in the market and make you the seller of choice for those different components. And it's going to become more and more important as we see more of these electric vehicles on the road. And again, when we think about the complexity of these components, these vehicles are at the cutting edge of the automotive complexity revolution that's taking place right now. When you look at the sheet metal parts, this is something that's really interesting. And I'm glad people were mentioning the weight of these batteries. The weight of the batteries is such a key factor for how the OEMs manufacture and design these vehicles, because they have to look at, how do I offset that weight? An average EV battery is 1,600 to 2,000 pounds. That's a lot of weight to that vehicle. So you have to reduce weight in other places. One of the ways, and one of the prime ways that manufacturers are doing that, is by using more lightweight substrates throughout the closure components, throughout the structure of the vehicle. So these are things like aluminum, carbon fiber, composites, these different sorts of alloys that are coming out. We're seeing a whole suite of materials that we've never even been exposed to before. But again, just like we saw with the digital complexity with the fault codes, the more electrified the vehicle becomes, the higher the percentage of lightweight content is in that vehicle. So lightweight content here we define as anything that's not mild steel. So we're going from 22% to almost 30% in an electric vehicle. So what this tells me is you've got more of these components that are constructed of things like aluminum. Aluminum is the number one lightweight material that's being used by manufacturers right now. And manufacturers are doing it in a way where you could see where you've got an ICE vehicle and then you have kind of an electrified variant of it. And there's different decisions that are being made on the electrified variant. So what you see is, this is just one example. This is a 2018 Audi A3. The image on the top is from the gas engine vehicle, and the one on the bottom is from the e-tron, which is the plug-in. In the gas engine vehicle, it's got steel fenders, just normal, regular, mild steel that we've all grown to know and love. But the e-tron now has aluminum fenders. So this may seem like a simple distinction, but what this means for a number of different stakeholders, and our insurance clients in the room have heard me talk about this, the more lightweight content you have on a vehicle, the less likely it is that you have the chance to repair those parts. And I know the collision repairers in the room have heard me say this too. You simply just don't have the same opportunities to fix a part that is constructed of aluminum or carbon fiber or composites that you do with steel. Steel has a memory. Steel likes to go back to the shape that it was formed in. Aluminum doesn't. All these other materials, they don't have that memory. They disperse crash energy by cracking as opposed to deforming. So you think about these two vehicles getting into an accident, these two Audi A3s, those fenders are going to look different because of the material they're constructed of. So what does that mean? When we look at repair versus replacement rates in the collision repair industry, we see when a manufacturer goes from mild steel to a lightweight component. So they change the construction from essentially steel to either aluminum, high-strength steel, composite, whatever that is. The rate of repair drops by about 10 percentage points every single time, or more. So these parts are just less repairable. So as a recycler, what that means is you have more shots to sell parts. I mean, these are more opportunities that are coming your way as these parts go towards a more lightweight construction. And the move towards electrification simply just ramps that process up. And again, these vehicles are at the cutting edge of complexity, the cutting edge of construction complexity as well. What this also means is you have to take another look at your processes around end-of-life vehicle harvesting. So before that vehicle goes into your crush pile, what are the steps that you have to take to not only decore the vehicle, harvest the aluminum. I think you've always been harvesting those aluminum rebars and any wheels that are left on the vehicle. But now you're looking at, well, what is the rest of the vehicle comprised of? Now I have to look at, do I have to take the fenders off this vehicle? Because I'm going to get 4 times as much for an aluminum fender as I am in crush weight. These vehicles have, as previously mentioned, significantly more copper wire. And so now you're looking at 8 times more value from that copper wire than you are from crush weight. So there's a lot of extra commodity money that is on the table before these vehicles go into your crush pile. So taking that extra time at harvesting, you have to analyze, where does that make sense? What's kind of the sweet spot for the time that can be devoted to that harvesting process? But I really believe that this is one area where understanding the content of the vehicles that are in your yard, especially for these electric vehicles, can really lead to some significant returns. With a high ROI, spending a little bit of time at the harvesting process before that vehicle goes to crush, you can start to sort out more of these valuable commodities and really get a higher return without a lot of extra investment on these electric vehicles, in addition to all the additional parts, okay? And we'll talk about parts here in just a minute. So the last piece differentiating these vehicles is the cycle time that we see. On average, we're seeing about 2.5 extra days of cycle time for an electric vehicle, for one that is 2018 model year newer and drivable, okay? And it's the same standard for all these other propulsion types. So 2.5 extra days of cycle time for these vehicles in repair facilities. Paul, would you say that's kind of a lot? Are you seeing longer cycle times for your EVs when they're in the shop?
I mean, the supply chain right now is another basket, but I can see how the complexity rising would allow for or account for 2.5 extra days.
Yeah.
I can see that.
And when we look at average labor hours, the average labor hours are about 6 additional labor hours for an electric vehicle. So just managing that battery alone takes a significant amount of time. If we look at that Audi A3, and that's just a plug-in. We're not talking, that's not even a full EV. Just the R&I of the battery is about 2.5 mechanical hours. And you say, well, why do you have to R&I the battery? Well, shops are having to R&I the battery, remove and install the battery more frequently because of the fact that, as was mentioned, Maria, the temperature piece. Once you get over a certain temperature, these batteries start to degrade. At a certain point, that heat will actually generate internal damage to the battery. And you might not know it today, you might not know it a week from now, you might not know it 6 months from now. But that battery will slowly be degraded inside. It can actually cause corrosion and can cause an explosion or a fire. So the battery can't go into the paint booth, essentially, is what we're seeing. So the shops are having a lot of additional labor, a lot of additional work, a lot of additional thought that goes into an EV repair. So when we look at the overall cost of repair on these vehicles, this is just showing you some of the most common electric vehicles in Canada. So the bar chart is showing you essentially the volume of these vehicles, and what you see here is it's very Tesla concentrated, and you'll see that even more here in just a minute. This is a very concentrated market right now, with Tesla essentially having about 75% market share. That is changing though, and we are seeing some of these other legacy OEMs and some of their model offerings start to increase market share really very consistently. And I think that's going to continue as we see more and more of these offerings that are being brought. There's more options out there in the marketplace. But what the dots are here on this chart are showing you the average cost of repair for these vehicles. The blue line is the average cost of repair for all of Canada, and then the dots are the average cost of repair for each of these vehicles. So you look at the Tesla models, and obviously they're way above where everybody else is. But even when you look at some of these other legacy models, I mean, just even the Chevy Bolt is a few $100s higher than where the rest of the industry is. The Mustang Mach-E is a couple $1,000s higher than where the rest of the industry is. So there's really a pretty significant cost of repair difference. So as a recycler, what this is telling me is that, number one, these vehicles have a higher value. They're totaling at a lower rate than internal combustion vehicles right now. Again, if we look at 2018 model year newer vehicles in Canada in 2022, those totaled at about 7.5% to 8% rate. EVs in that same bucket totaled about 5%. So more of these vehicles are being repaired than internal combustion engine vehicles because of their higher ACV. So again, this presents more sales opportunities from a recycler standpoint. And the beauty of these vehicles is that you don't have as much competition from aftermarket companies. So if we look at the percentage of parts that are being written on these estimates, so on the left-hand chart, showing you some of those common models again, very concentrated. The purple lines are showing you the aftermarket parts utilization, and the blue lines are showing you the recycled parts. Now, I don't want you to pay too much attention to the recycled parts lines. Those are very small, but we also have to understand a lot of companies are shying away from these. There's not a lot of inventory that's in facilities right now. But if you look at those aftermarket parts, they're not competing with you. I mean, you're talking about the max for any of these vehicles is 4%. And what I would say is, if we dove deeper into these numbers, I would say that what we're actually seeing that is probably not on major component parts. That's probably coating on some ancillary parts that are going on these estimates, and not things like bumpers, fenders, headlamps, doors, and hoods. So you have a captive market here. And so I think this is what, we see essentially 93, 94% OEM parts utilization on electric vehicles. So this is something where inventorying these vehicles correctly, spending extra time during the inventory process, really dialing in the quality of that inventory, making sure that there's very clear understanding, very clear notes about what that inventory looks like, is going to be very critical here, because you are the alternative parts provider for electric vehicles. There essentially is not another option right now. And again, think about that overall North American car park. How can you potentially scale and create processes in place in your businesses to be able to send some of these parts into the United States? David?
Ryan, do the automakers share that sentiment that, recyclers are going to be the ones to look at it? It's 95% plus new OEM. Specifically, even the 75% of the car park is one particular brand right now. Because I'm sitting beside a friend that's got one, and it's for salvage, and we're thinking it's going to go the option because we don't want to touch it. I don't know if personally anyone is making money on these vehicles. But the chart and the dot should lend itself to, we should be able to make a lot of money on these vehicles. I'm not saying that now, and I don't know if the trend is going to get better or worse in our case, because the recyclers are concerned about that, and all automakers should be in terms of the reuse of the product, which is Genesis is a big part of what you're talking about.
So number one, I'll get to here in just one quick second. So number one, I can't speak for the automakers in terms of their sentiments. I would say that from my understanding of their position statements and where they stand today and where they pretty much always stand, is they recommend the use of their own parts.
Right.
So
in other words, it's not warranty if you use their genuine OEM,
I wouldn't necessarily say that. Most of the statements don't specify that. Most statements just say that they recommend the use of new OEM parts and leave it at that. And I think part of that, there's a right to repair conversation in there, especially in the States. So I think the OEMs will always say that they recommend the use of brand new parts whenever possible. That being said, I think that and this is me being biased, but a recycled part is clearly advantageous to an aftermarket part in that it was built by the manufacturer, it meets the manufacturer's quality, it is an OEM part. But again, I think why we're not seeing a larger percentage of these parts being sold, number one is I think we haven't crossed that tipping point yet to where recyclers are saying, yes, we are going to buy these. This is, because you have to be in the right market in many cases, right? If you're in Saskatchewan, that may not be your best strategy. So I think that there's still a little bit of unknown for a lot of recyclers right now in terms of buying these vehicles, and I think there's a lot of hesitancy for anyone to honestly write a non-OEM part on a Tesla.
And that's a big issue, because it boggles our mind how they want to, or how automakers want to tell themselves as being green, but as we're discussing feels like it's a scourge from the recycler standpoint, and that's why their numbers are so low. Whether it's position statements or, hey, it won't work, we won't be able to transfer the part from A to B, and those are bolt-on parts, some of them won't work, because all these thousands of semiconductors and software across being computers on wheels. And that's, I think, very important to everyone in the room, but specifically recyclers who want to know, and you're right, you're always just wanting to talk about this with your experience in all spectrums, So it's helpful to hear, just to hear, so at least those recyclers sitting in the room can start turning, okay, this is more meaningful than just chemistry.
It is. And the last piece I'd say before I get to your question over here is, what we are seeing is that most, and this is really true in Canada, not so much in the US right now, is the insurance industry is under a big push for environmental stewardship and sustainability. Your business, and I'll talk about this a little bit tomorrow, but your businesses, obviously align very well with that. And so if I were running a recycler in Canada, I would be looking at how do I partner with the insurance industry to really make this part of the push towards that sustainability initiative. And again, we'll talk more about that tomorrow. Yeah, go ahead.
One more comment on Dave's.
Yeah.
But there are companies, all EV was mentioned earlier in Nova Scotia, but their genesis was dismantling electric vehicles, Teslas, more talking about, and they made big money on recycling components, but they didn't use our Hollander interchange to sell them. They sold them on eBay, and they learned what components would go through different models, and very different to how our interchange is structured, like completely different, because our interchange is for ICE vehicles. So you can do it, and there's big money there, but you can't do it with our existing systems.
And I
eBay play,
yeah.
it's another thing.
The niche, very small niche.
Yeah.
And I would say, obviously I don't work for Solera, but I would imagine that we'll see Hollander interchanges evolve over time. And I would say, with the other companies, that those interchanges would evolve over time as well. We at Mitchell, we're evolving our estimating database to have an EV framework. And so if I were to kind of imagine in my own mind, you would have a Hollander interchange for an ICE vehicle, a set of interchanges, and you would have a set of interchanges for EVs that looks different. That's kind of how I would set it up. I don't know that that's what's going to happen, but I would imagine out of necessity we're going to see an evolution of that system to make it more efficient for you to sell these parts.
I think that the point is just how fast it's coming and how typically that stuff is slowly reacting.
Yes.
So it's frustrating for us, but yeah.
Agreed. Yeah, go ahead.
Just a question about your scrap rate comment.
Mm-hmm.
I just read like a Reuters report that said that EVs are being scrapped earlier than ICE vehicles because of the comments you mentioned around the battery as well as all the components that are not steel and repairable. But you just said like complete opposite stat. So just kind of curious, the regional difference between the U.S. and Reuters, I'm sure they're focused more on the U.S.
Yeah, and our numbers are just based on essentially the total loss flag that's passed over to us by insurance carriers. So that may look different depending on I don't know what data source they used for that. But I think there's a myth out there that, because I think we've all heard these stories, there was minor damage on a Tesla and it got totaled. Well, yes, that does happen, but that is a rare scenario because of a specific pattern of damage. That is not because it had minor damage, so to speak. It's just because of the pattern of where it was damaged. So I think that the scrappage rate, again, we'd have to, I'm guessing we're probably just pulling from two different data sets, but the fact that these vehicles have a higher ACV just in general, significantly higher. We're talking, double what an ICE vehicle on average is valued at. So that's really where we're seeing that difference and just the economics of it. So I'm sure we're probably just looking at two different data anchoring type of points.
You're right, Ryan, because the set that maybe Reuters used to look at is what's been sold at the auction for 20 or 30 grand, which is likely not going to be parted out by any niche recycler.
Right.
It's going on a ship somewhere and then put on the road somewhere else.
Exactly. And we're still seeing, and that export activity, I think, is still continuing. And I would say not only for EVs, but for all vehicle types as well. So that's a huge point of competition right now.
And that Reuters, it was an article written by an author or writer not in the industry, kind of looking at different news reports, creating an article where this is data and it's reports, and there's a big difference. There's a huge amount of misinformation in the entire electrification area that you have to really understand where someone's coming from to just go, that's clickbait.
Yeah. The one thing I'll say real quick just about the battery, I said I wasn't going to talk about batteries, but I'll say one thing. The benefit of all of these second life type of applications, the use as a capacitor, the different things that both Jeff talked about, looking at that map, and that map has grown tremendously over the years. The beauty of that is essentially your powertrain is now the battery. The battery, you no longer need to wait for the powertrain to fail to find a buyer. I think that's one of the really interesting things about this shift in propulsion types is on day one, when you have that 2023 model year EV in your facility, you potentially have a buyer for that powertrain. That is much less likely for a 2023 V6 Honda Accord, that you have a buyer for that V6 Honda Accord engine. So I think that's an interesting thing that we can actually look at this as a cash flow positive and to reduce the cycle time essentially and reduce the time that you're getting your ROI out of these vehicles. So just something I want to point out just real quick. The chart on the right is looking at the average number of replacement parts and the parts dollars for some of those EV models as well. This pink dotted line is the average number of replacement parts for ICE vehicles in Canada, so which is just under 10. So you look at some of these, and again, we're talking about very concentrated. Look at those 2 Teslas in the front, we're talking about 20 parts on average. 20 parts being replaced on that vehicle. You look at these, the higher end Teslas, and we're above 30. So all of these are additional points of potential sales that can be made because there's more opportunities on these vehicles. And again, it's not necessarily these moving components, it's these complex assemblies that are on these vehicles, okay? So when we look at the specific parts on these vehicles, what this is showing you, and Steve will send out a copy of this presentation, so you don't need to read all the specifics on the bottom, but these are the top 30 most commonly replaced OEM parts on electric vehicles today in Canada, okay? 50% of all the parts replaced on EVs in Canada are these 30 parts right here. So that's how concentrated this market is. If you look at the ICE market, the top 30 parts make up 8% of the total parts sold. Okay, so big difference there, right? But what's interesting is when you look at this, and obviously there's bumper covers and headlamps and hoods and things like that. The average price of one of these top 30 parts on an EV in Canada is $673. The average price of one of those top 30 parts for an ICE vehicle in Canada is $486. There's addition, so I'm just trying to plant some seeds here for you. You've got a couple $100, 50% delta essentially in the average OEM cost of these parts. And with supply chains the way they are right now, the likelihood of these parts being available is lower today than it has been essentially at any time in recent history, well, except for the end of 2021. But so there's additional financial opportunities here in the shift towards electrification. I keep coming back to that because I think there's a lot of people that are looking at the industry right now and saying, well, electrification is going to potentially be damaging to the auto recycling industry. I definitely don't see it that way. And I think a lot of these numbers are pointing to the fact that there may actually be additional opportunities in the future for businesses that are able to capitalize on it and put processes in place to monetize these different aspects of EVs that are not present in terms of the current market with internal combustion engine vehicles. And just to give you an idea, when we look at some of these vehicles where there is an ICE vehicle and then there's a electrified variant, just between those, we see that there's big differences. So that's probably the best apples to apples way to look at this and what that shift to electrification means. So when you look here, this is showing you a couple different examples. So you've got the Audi A3 versus the e-tron, okay, so that kind of example with the fenders that we looked at, the Mustang and the Mach-E, the Hyundai Kona and the electrified Kona, and then the Soul and the EV Soul. So this is showing you, and again, we're only looking at 2018 model year and newer here to, again, have more apples to apples. In each of these examples, and these were just the most clear ones, the EV variant of that vehicle is more costly to repair than the internal combustion engine one. In some cases, by a significant amount. Now you look at the e-tron, you know, we may be talking about a volume issue there that might account for some of that difference, but the Kona and the Kona EV, we're seeing significant amounts of volume in both of those. We see these same trends for US numbers as well. So you look at, you know, $1,100 difference between the Kona and the Kona EV, you know, $1,000 difference between the Soul and the Soul EV. So we're talking 25% difference, 25% delta. And it's the same vehicle, but one is an ICE and one is an EV. So that's why I say we have to really look at these not just as an electrified version of what we've previously known, but as something wholly different. Yes?
By volume, Ryan, excuse me, I'm just curious, these electric vehicles, the myth is that they make all these bad drivers good with all the sensors, but by volume, are you seeing, maybe it's too early, are you seeing less? Like the graph shows you're going to make more on that part, but by volume, are you seeing less claims with the EV versus the
Yes.
ICE?
Yes, we are. And that's to be expected.
Sure,
I mean,
absolutely.
you know, and I think we'll still exist in this period where both variants are being offered by manufacturers, especially think about the Mustang. I mean, there's always going to be a market for a Mustang with a V8, right? So I think that we'll still exist in kind of both worlds for a little while. And I think that we'll still see the internal combustion engine be kind of the top dog for a while. And again, when you look at some of these predictions, I mean, the most realistic predictions show that the car park in Canada is going to be about 10% EV by 2030. Okay, that means 90% of the car park is going to have an internal combustion engine. Okay, so the internal combustion engine is not going away, and I think that's where we have to be a little bit careful with some of this, is understanding, yes, we have to prepare for this because this is so different, but this is not a complete change in transportation. Our transportation, as we know it, is not completely going away, but it is evolving. Okay, so that's kind of how I think we have to parse it a little bit when we look at this. So when you look at these vehicles, not only do you see that the cost is higher, so that's not just related to the additional labor with the battery, but we also see that the replacement parts are greater. So what you see is the same four vehicles. The blue bars are showing you the internal combustion engine variant, and then the green bars are showing you the EV variant. So we're talking about a difference of between 1 and 3.5 parts on average. Well, 1 to 3.5 parts may not sound like a whole lot, but the average replacement part is about $200. So that adds up pretty quickly. So in each of these instances, there are more parts that are being replaced on the EV variant of the same exact vehicle than on the internal combustion engine vehicle. So again, I think what this points to is, number one, it's a lot of challenges for many of the stakeholders in the room. The repair facilities, the insurance carriers trying to appropriately price policies on these vehicles. And there seems to be this notion out there that these vehicles should be less costly to insure, but that could not be more wrong. Jeff and I were talking about that a little bit earlier. There's definitely, all the evidence points to the fact that these vehicles should be more expensive to insure because of the additional cost pressures that are out there. And then, but I think all of those challenges can point again to opportunity. And I think that's what we're seeing when we look at the data around these vehicles. Just to give you an idea, overall we see about a 33% cost delta between all EVs and internal combustion engine vehicles. When you look at Tesla, that number is 44%. So Tesla's definitely kind of in a league of its own. What this is showing you is just a very rough projection of where we expect the average cost of repair to go in Canada, with and without electrification. So the blue line is showing you kind of the forecasted path of electrification, of EV adoption in Canada. The purple lines on the left are showing you if we didn't have any more EV adoption beyond what we have today, where would we expect severity to grow to, the average cost of collision repair? And we can expect that to go up to about $7,200 by 2035, is where we see it. Okay, we're about $4,500, $4,600 today. Well, with the growth of electrification, if we continue on with the same trajectory, the same cost delta, we would expect that number to get closer to $8,000 by 2035. Okay, so this is showing you where we see severity going. I would actually argue that we're probably going to see that delta shrink over time as we see more of the watering down of Tesla's market share. Again, I think there'll be more of these legacy OEMs that start to gain market share over Tesla. We're already starting to see it, and I think that'll water down some of that delta. But there is a delta. Even again, when we look at like for like, that Kia Soul versus the Soul EV, it's the same exact car, but it really isn't. It's the same shape, but that car is totally different. And we see that 25% delta. So I think that that is more along the lines of what we expect to see, is kind of that 20 to 25% increase in cost for the electric variant of an internal combustion engine vehicle. So the last thing I'll leave you with is, if you're interested in hearing more of our views and insights on the path of electrification in the industry, we just started publishing a quarterly insights newsletter, essentially. It comes out usually about a month or so after the end of a quarter. You can subscribe to it on our website. There's a link in here. And it really just gives you an idea of where is the EV adoption rate headed, what are some of the trends that we're seeing on the estimates themselves, on the repairs that are being done. What are we seeing in that data? And again, we're leaning a lot on Canadian data because you have a higher percentage of these vehicles that are getting repaired right now. You'll see things like, what does that severity look like? We look at the cost of repair both with and without Tesla in here, so you can kind of get an idea of how much Tesla's impacting that number as a whole. But some good stuff in there. Definitely, feel free to check that out. And with that, I just want to say thank you. I always love being around recyclers again. It's a ton of fun for me, and happy to take any questions.